Chapter 191, The Tip of the Iceberg, Revision. In the north of the Central Plains, the Tatars were repelled by the iron hooves of the Great Dry several decades ago, and since then they have withdrawn from the southern desert, and for many years they have succumbed to the Central Plains and no longer invaded the border. Its land is vast and barren, the people live nomadically, there are few fixed places, only the Oro River flows through the territory, because of the abundance of water and grass, over the years to gather into a community. The capital of the Tatar kings was built in the bay area of the middle reaches of the Oro River. At night, the tent decorated with 5-colored silk is lit up, and from the outside it looks like a huge lantern. There are a few small hills in the distance. On one of the south-facing hills, a tall steed could be faintly seen, and next to the steed stood a woman in a bearded robe. The handmaid came from a distance, and when she saw this delicate back, she almost shed tears. She finally calmed down, walked forward with a smile on her face, and happily shouted to the front, "Your Highness, it is getting late, and the wind is so strong at night, you can be careful not to blow your body. Let's go back to the tent." Shenzai stood still. She looked at the southeastern homeland that was flooded by desert smoke and dark purple darkness, and only asked, "Is there still no news?" The weather in the north is cold, the climate is dry, and the wind and sand are heavy. Without the feng shui of the Central Plains, her delicate cheeks in the past inevitably left some traces of wind and frost, although they are as beautiful as before, but the slightly plump cheeks in the past have been thinner a lot, and there is a feeling of a few points of pinning. It's just that compared to the change in appearance, the most striking thing may be the eyes. The deep twilight fell into her eyes like ink. The vivid divine light of the past has disappeared under the tempering of suffering, but it is like a dagger hidden in a sheath, with an unprecedented, forbearant etch. The maidservant naturally knows what the princess has been through all these years. When they first entered the court of the Huns, they had more than 20 palace people. In less than a year, however, only 4 remained. Some of those who left couldn't stand the hard flight of the northern desert, some missed their homeland thousands of miles away and asked to leave, and some were tortured and punished by the Tatar nobles and couldn't bear it. On the surface, she is an imperial princess who is extremely noble and comes to kiss. But under the gorgeous crown, there is a cruel shackle. It's not so much a princess, a Tatar princess, but a prisoner who can't help herself. The maidservant couldn't bear to confide the news from outside, so she only walked up and gently tugged at the princess's sleeve, and said, "The secret letter has only been sent out not long ago, presumably even if they arrive at the border pass, those people will not dare to act without permission, and they must be sent to the capital to report to the saint before they can decide. You are the princess of Dakian, the blood of the royal family, the saint, and the queen mother. You will definitely order to send troops to attack the Huns and save you out. Will you save her?" Shenzai's distant gaze fell. In late autumn, the trees were withered and yellow, and the grass was withered. She only looked at the turf under her feet that had been gnawed by the horses, bent down, picked up a piece of rotten grass roots from the yellow and black soil, and smiled sharply. The peonies in the Forbidden City are carefully taken care of by people, and they cannot be blown by wind or rain. The barren grass of Mobei is deeply rooted in the barren soil, throwing away its delicate colors and putting itself low, just to survive in the dry and cold invasion. Under the wind, his fingers were already cold. She looked at this piece of grass root and sighed long. "I used to think that if I became a piece of grass, there would be a day when spring came. But this autumn or winter, it's too long, too long." In the distance, a trumpet sounded at night. In the bleak wind, it was like a long whimper. The last bit of light on the hillside disappeared, and Shenzai's figure finally merged with the boundless darkness, regardless of each other.
星号
On the night of departure, Zhang Xuning had a nightmare. She dreamed that she was standing on the high walls of the capital, the faces of the people around her were blurred, and the voices were loud and noisy, and she seemed to be trying to distinguish something from them. It was a cry from the end of the long street. The snow-white guard of honor was like a thin river, gradually approaching, and a grand and solemn coffin floated silently on this river. She was on the city wall, so far away, but she could see it clearly. So, at this moment of seeing clearly, the city wall under his feet suddenly collapsed. She fell from a great height, and in a moment of panic, she shouted in a hurry, "Don't dash!" The person suddenly sat up from the bed. Cold sweat was thick on his forehead, but the hazy and paradoxical feeling in the dream was still wandering in the body. Jiang Xuning did it in the bed tent for a long time, slowly stroked his chest, and the palpitations did not dissipate. She got up and pushed open the window and looked out. This time, the sky in the south of the Yangtze River is bright. A lone lamp hangs in the hallway. The oblique White House is in the Wei Alley. There are no merchants nearby, there are no hard-working people at this hour, and there are no traders who get up early and are greedy for darkness. It is a silence, as if it is an isolated island. Today we will leave for the border gate. Jiang Xuning didn't know what her dream portended, and she didn't want to speculate whether everyone in the world had their own destiny. She only knows that if she wants to change, she has no choice but to move forward. Even if you seek skin with the tiger, you will fight for the tiger. At the end of the day, the two maids carried their bags, and Jiang Xuning went out of the oblique White House. A carriage had stopped outside the door on time. The sky will be dark. Standing next to the carriage was neither a sword and a piano nor a sword book, but Lucien, who was wearing a literati robe. This profiteer from the capital has knowledge and insight that is difficult for his peers to achieve. Even if he is full of merchandising calculations, he looks elegant and square, which makes the uninformed feel broken. When Jiang Xuning saw him, her steps were stunned. Lucien greeted her outside the Siewei gate of the annex yesterday, and at this moment he bowed his hand and said with a smile, "Second Miss Ning didn't seem very happy to see Lu." Jiang Xuning didn't have much opinion on him, but he was very unhappy with Siewei yesterday. She has never wanted to be pressed to do things. Although the accounts have been sorted out, in order to save the princess, he is indeed ready to pay all his net worth, but these plans do not include being coerced. But Siewei used the eldest princess as a threat. So now, looking at this number 1 KO-headed military division under Siewei, it is not so pleasant. Her attitude was not enthusiastic, and she only said lightly, "Yesterday, I explained to Fang Yin, stay in Jiangnan, and if Boss Fan Lu is on a business, she will listen to it. Everything is complicated, although the industry is not large, hundreds of thousands of cash can be obtained. Boss Lu should be so busy that his feet don't touch the ground right now. Come here in person today. Isn't there any account that can't be matched, and he has some advice?" Lucien shook his head, "Not really. You must know that he appeared here at this moment, but he didn't even hide Siewei." Jiang Xuning raised her eyebrows. "Oh." Lucien looked at her and said, "I'm here to entrust you something." Jiang Xuning was confused when she heard this. It's just that she is going north today, and what she agreed with Siewei is to meet outside Jinling City at the second moment of the first day of Chen, but there is not much time to waste. "Long story short?" she asked. "Long story short?" Lucien was stunned. "It's a long story." Jiang Xuning waved her hand and said, "I'm in a hurry, so I'll ask Boss Lu to get in the car and talk while walking." Lucien. His eyes moved to the carriage, and his face was almost green, as if he was looking not at a sturdy, spacious carriage, but at a death row. Jiang Xuning wondered, "Boss Lu doesn't come up." Lucien pressed his beating eyelids, gritted his teeth, and his heart may not be so unlucky. He turned around and was caught, and as soon as he closed his eyes ruthlessly, he followed into the carriage. The two sat opposite each other. Jiang Xuning instructed the coachman to go outside the city first, and then turned his head and said to Lucien, "What is Boss Lu entrusting?" Lucien put his fingers on his knees, but he looked Zhang Xuning up and down. After a long time, she said, Miss Ning Er has been selling silk and transporting salt all over the years, and has traveled all over the world. I don't know if you have ever heard of a place called Yin County. Indeed, as Lucien said, Zhang Xuning has been to many places over the years. The map of the Central Plains is basically engraved in my mind. It is a small place in Ningbo, Zhejiang. She thought for a moment and said, I've heard of it, but I've never been there. Lucien's face showed a bit of memory, and he smiled slightly and said, It's not a secret, Lu went here when he was a teenager on a study tour. The folk customs are simple, and the countryside is peaceful. It's just that many years ago, a county magistrate was appointed in this place, and there was an unwritten rule for collecting taxes over the years. When the common people paid their taxes, they wrote their names on white paper and put them in boxes, while the squires and wealthy families paid their taxes, they wrote their names on red paper and put them in boxes. Zhang Xuning frowned slightly when she heard this. Although she didn't know why Lucien said this, the common people paid taxes with the squires and the wealthy households, and they were distinguished by different colors of paper. Sure enough, Lucien continued, where the red paper is paid for taxes, the government should act according to the law, but when the tax is paid on white paper, the government officials will ask the people to collect more money on top of the taxes set by the imperial court, which is called the tea and hard money for the officials and gentlemen, at first only 1% more, and later 2%. Zhang Xuning said, the dog official is bold enough. Lucien laughed, yes, the dog is bold. Therefore, as time goes by, the heavier the tax, the more unhappy the people become. So there was a commotion, and a crowd was gathered to petition. It happened that a man who knew how to write and could write passed through this place, and when he knew that the government was not in accordance with the law, he wrote a complaint for them. A cotter of people led by this person entered the city from the countryside and went to the yamen to ask the government to cancel the difference between red and white paper and settle the grain tax. Zhang Xuning said, the government has soldiers, and it is easy for the people to make trouble, but it may not be easy to get things done. This scholar not only reads books and knows the law, but also meddles in affairs, for fear that he will get angry. Lucien glanced at her, and his smile faded a little. He said, not bad. It is nothing more than a group of rural villagers who have asked someone to write a complaint, and how can the county magistrate take them seriously? As the saying goes, killing chickens and setting an example for monkeys. The county magistrate couldn't help but say, and directly arrested this person, put him in prison, and convicted him of gathering a crowd. Our court decrees that gathering a crowd is a serious crime, and the lightest sentence must be immediately executed. Zhang Xuning's brows furrowed. She already felt that Lucien's storytelling was secondary, and that this person might be the point. With a roll of her eyes, she said, isn't this person you are talking about? Lucien shook his head suddenly, and said, Lu is a layman, seeking advantages and avoiding disadvantages. It's too late to hide when he encounters this kind of thing. Where will he wade into this troubled water? Zhang Xuning was non-committal. What happened later? Lu Xiandao, this person asked for the life of the people, and was suddenly sentenced to be beheaded, who is not angry in the countryside. And in the year of disaster, internal and external difficulties, in anger, a lot of people actually gathered, poured into the city, surrounded the county government, rescued people not to mention, but also pulled the county lord down from the hall and beat him, escorted him to the outside of the city god temple, showed insult to the public, and forced him to write a notice of equal grain tax from now on. At the end, a fire burned the county office. As the saying goes, poor mountains and bad waters come out of the people. The folk customs are simple and true, and the plagiarism is also true. Zhang Xuning said, this is a big disaster. Lucien sighed lightly, who said it wasn't? The county magistrate did this, so it was naturally useless. The governor Yaman soon sent a new county official named Zhou Guangqing. Ning Er has been to Ningbo, and she should know that this person is now an official to the prefect, and she has some ability. Jiang Xuning was curious, how can he solve it? Lu Xiandao, when Zhou Guangqing arrives in office, first call these troublesome villagers over and ask them one by one, are they going to rebel? Jiang Xuning's heart was slightly cold. Lu Xian ridiculed, the villagers are angry when they do things, and when they calm down, they realize that burning the county government is a crime of rebellion. How can they dare to admit it? In front of Zhou Guangqing, he repeatedly denied it. Zhou Guangqing asked the reason, but he asked in a loud voice, the yamen was burned, and he still said that he would not rebel. The villagers did not see much, did not know much, panicked, and came to ask Zhou Guangqing what to do. The villagers don't know the law, and burning the yamen is a rage that cannot be unrestrained for a while, but the knife must be on the neck, who cannot be greedy for life and afraid of death. Jiang Xuning had already expected this result first. She said, even coaxing and scare, it is effortless to calm things down. Lu Xian sneered, Zhou Guangqing has been an official for many years, and he knows very well that as an official, he must govern the people, and taxes can be paid from the people. So he gave these people an idea, saying, the matter is so big, the court will inevitably send a messenger to investigate. If you are afraid, it is better to clear yourself first, write a letter to the county government, and declare that you have not entered the city to make trouble. He also said that he immediately settled the grain tax for them, and asked them to pay this year's grain tax as soon as possible, so as to prove that they had no objection. In this way, Qin sent officers and soldiers to investigate, and they also captured the thief and the king, and only went to arrest the person who was the leader, but could not catch them. At this point, he paused. Jiang Xuning admired it very much, divide it and turn it into a beating. It's a pity that this nosy man is afraid that he will be unlucky. Lu Xian listened to the sound of the wheels running over the ground, as well as the gradually lively sound of the street market, and smiled faintly. Within 7 days, hundreds of submissions to clear the relationship were handed to Zhou Guangqing's table. The man has been rescued and is missing. The government posted a notice to arrest this person, offered a reward of 300 taels, and did not allow him to harbor, and summoned the villagers to report his whereabouts to the government. Jiang Xuning was silent. Suddenly, he felt a little sad. The people are breadwinners, who cannot flinch in the face of life and death. It's just that this person helped them, shouldn't he report it to the government? Lu Xian laughed and said, second Miss Ning has said it, this is human nature. In this way, the wealth are moving in front of the people, and if no one is caught, the matter will not be concluded in a day. And how do you know if the villagers will be blamed again? Within 3 days, someone reported it to the government. Jiang Xuning was speechless. Lu Xian leisurely, it's just that this person was not arrested by the officers and soldiers sent by the government in the end, he came to surrender by himself. Jiang Xuning was stunned suddenly. This was a big surprise to her. How? Lu Xiandao, I thought so back then. How could it be? It was a sunny afternoon. Everything is as usual in the county, bustling with activity. Lu Xian was in the inn, pondering and composing poems, when he suddenly heard an errand running from the street, shouting as he ran, saying that he was the culprit of gathering a crowd to rebel, and he came to surrender and went to the county office. All of a sudden, thousands of people were empty. When the villagers heard about it, they all went. At the entrance of the reconstructed county office, the crowd was crowded, and the spectators were blocked. Zhou Guangqing sat high in the hall. Lu Xian was crowded in the crowd, but he looked down the hall. He has always been hanging high and unconcerned about himself, just thinking that this person is involved in the game and getting covered in mud, which is stupid enough, and now he is still surrendering himself, I don't know what kind of bookworm and reckless man he is. However, when I saw it clearly, I was shocked. His person stood under the hall, dressed in a snow-white robe, standing tall, and was a deep and handsome person. Where is the state of a mob and a bandit? Only 5 points of calm and calm, 5 points of calm and calm, although in the midst of danger, witnessed by everyone, there is no half of anxiety and anxiety. On the other hand, the villagers around them all looked evasive, and their faces were ashamed. That day was a court trial made by Zhou Guangqing himself. Lucien thought that Zhou Guangqing should be like himself, and he still remembers that day vividly. This person confessed to what he did. Although Zhou Guangqing came up with this plan to divide people's hearts, he did not expect this person to surrender by himself. At that time, I felt that the eldest husband should be like this, and I couldn't help but praise him, saying that he was doing things alone. But he looked at the villagers for a long time, and no one dared to look directly at him, so he lowered his head. This person was still very calm, and he couldn't see any joy or anger. Then, a word was spoken. Zhang Xuning was already a little absorbed in what she heard, and subconsciously asked, "What did you say?" The wind blew the curtains, and pedestrians bustled outside. Lucien's eyes fell on the window, recalling this incident. It was like a dream, and he only said, "The world has been decided, I will cook. The world has been decided, I will cook." In the history books, Han Xin once said when he was at the end of his rope, "The cunning rabbit is dead, the lackeys are cooked, the high birds are exhausted, the good bow is hidden, the enemy country is broken, and the ministers are killed." It is the bustle of the world for profit, and the hustle and bustle of the world for profit. People's hearts are back, and they can change in an instant. Zhang Xuning was silent after thinking carefully. Lucien said, "What does second Miss Ning think of this person?" Zhang Xuning stared at him for a long time and said, "Boss Lu is from Chenyushi, and he is a person with high ambitions and talents, and there are not many people in the world who can look up to you. I didn't know that Mr. Xie still had this past." She guessed it? Lucien couldn't help but sigh. Zhang Xuning was very indifferent, but what does this have to do with me? Lucien stared at her, only recalling Xie Wei's very abnormal appearance in the past 2 years, and said for a long time, "Lu Mao was born in the imperial examination in the old years, and he was a scholar and a first, but he was willing to serve Xie Zhuan's command. Do you know why?" Zhang Xuning said, "Isn't it because he may not win all the time, but he won't lose anyway?" Lucien was stunned at first, and then laughed out loud and said, "This is not bad." Zhang Xuning sneered. Lucien continued, "It's not just that." Zhang Xuning said, "Is it difficult or respect his character?" Lucien was silent for a moment, and said slowly, "Speaking of which, I may not believe it, the reason why I serve is not only to admire his strength, but also to be like a person who is drowning on the road and wants to pull it up." Drowning people, pull up. What a ruthless method, surnamed Xie. Where does he need the mercy of others? Zhang Xuning felt that Lucien had a hole in his head. Lucien said, "I came here, but I just thought, heaven and earth are like ovens, and red dust is like purgatory." Xie Zhuan struggled in it, but he was just a poor man. This way to the border, unpredictable changes. If there is really some accident, although the sword book is there, Lu knows that it may not be useful. Yes, I especially implore Miss Ning the Bodhisattva's heart, to pull him along. It's an ordinary entrustment, but it sounds quite heavy. Zhang Xuning didn't understand the deep meaning. What accidents can happen? Lucien only hoped that those clues in the past 2 years were his own worries, but it was not good to explain to Zhang Xuning, so he only said, "I hope Lu Mao thinks more." After speaking, he heard a shout from the coachman outside, "The city gate has arrived." He was startled, almost jumped up and hit the roof of the car, and fell to his feet and said regretfully, It's broken, it's broken. Zhang Xuning was at a loss. What's broken? Lucien didn't say a word, lifted the curtain and was about to drill out. By this time, however, the carriage had stopped. The gate of Jinling City is in front of you. Xie Wei's carriage waited quietly under the city walls. He stood beside the car in a pale green robe, staring at Lucien who came out of Zhang Xuaning's car. His pupils shrank slightly, and he glanced at Zhang Xuaning in the car, and a smile appeared on his originally expressionless face, and he only said lightly to Lucien, "You seem to be very idle." Lucien's hair stood on end. The person got out of the car, almost reflexively, and immediately said, "Second Miss Ning invited me to get into the carriage." Zhang Xuning. "No, I asked you to get in the car, but does it matter?" Before she could react, she just wanted to say that's the case, but she turned her head and met Xie Wei's eyes. Somehow, I shuddered all over my body. At that moment, her intuition of danger made her subconsciously deny throwing the pot. No, it was Boss Lu who said that he was looking for me for something. LV Xian? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He instantly turned his head and glared at Zhang Xuning. "How can you just throw the pot around? This will be a lawsuit." However, Xie Wei's gaze had already fallen lightly back on him at this time. Lucien. LV Xian. Who's not a human girl, and a vinegar tank. Please stop shouting, and call your grandfather again, and I will die on the spot to show you. Chapter 192, Get Out. Is the so-called person who inserts a knife in his brother's ribs, and often has to be stabbed twice by his brother and his brother's sweetheart. Lucien feels that his life is at stake. He was depressed, and he didn't dare to throw the pot back. Just kidding, the elbow surnamed Xie turned out of the sky. Can you believe him? He dared to say a word. Zhang Xuning, God knows what will happen later. Lucien racked his brains, trying to find a suitable excuse for himself. Unexpectedly, Xie Wei didn't seem to have anything abnormal, but smiled lightly, and continued, "Since you are not idle, why don't you hurry back and get busy?" Lucien was stunned. Huh? Xie Wei didn't look at him anymore, and turned straight to Zhang Xuning and said, "I went back to Jinling on this trip, but I went back to my hometown to worship my ancestors. On the same road with you, on the surface, I only said that I met by chance, and I had an old relationship with Zhang Shilang Zhang, so I will give you a ride along the way. Therefore, this road does not go straight to the border pass. First follow the road back to Beijing, and then change the route to the west, and then look on the road." Zhang Xuning was also stunned for a moment before she understood what he meant. Originally, she was puzzled. Xie Wei, a close minister of the Son of Heaven, once he left the capital, I don't know how many pairs of eyes were staring. If there is no suitable reason, I am afraid that it will not be good. I forgot that this person was a son of the Xie family in Jinling on the surface, and it was a sufficient excuse to go back to Jinling to worship his ancestors. And walking with her, it's easy to explain. After all, it has been 2 years since she left the capital, and it makes sense that Zhang Boye wants to take her back. This man, however, is thoughtful at all times. Use yourself as a shield. Zhang Xuning muttered in her heart, but she quickly agreed. Okay. Xie Wei said, let's go. Zhang Xuning didn't get out of the car in the first place, but at this moment, she promised again and wanted to get back into the car. But when he turned around, he couldn't help but glance at Lucien. Really, looking at this person's posture as if facing a great enemy, she thought that they had inadvertently committed Xie Wei's taboo, and something big was going to happen, which made her nervous. It turned out that nothing happened. There's nothing wrong with this man, right? Although this glance was simple and short-lived, what kind of shrewd person was Lucien? After being stunned for a moment, he immediately looked back and tasted the doubt and disdain in it, and for a while he really felt bitter in his heart and couldn't say it, so he glared at him with anger. I don't know if I think the scene is interesting, Siewei smiled. Lucien was even more bored and panicked. The swords, pianos, swords, and books are all there. One person drives a car, and one person rides a horse. He was accompanied by more than a dozen guards in strong suits who had been seen at the bottom of Guanlin downstairs, all of whom were masters, all of whom followed the two carriages. It was just dawn, and a mist hung over the gates. Siewei also got into the car. The group swaggered out of the city. As Siewei said, if they go straight to the border and fall into the eyes of those who have a heart, they will inevitably show clues, and they are afraid that they will miss a major event. Therefore, this trip did not go to Chezhou in the northwest direction, but took the official road to Yangzhou. Zhang Xuning didn't sleep well last night, and she just made up for sleep in the carriage. She has traveled a lot in the past 2 years, so the carriage is very comfortable, and there are no bumps and bumps. It's just that when I wake up, I'm bored. At first, I lifted the curtain to look outside, but the scenery in the south of the Yangtze River is nothing more than this. There will be no trees in the sky, and there will be no clouds floating on the ground. In addition to hurrying, this way is to rest. People spend most of their time in the car. She had to read a book. After all, I expected the long distance in advance, so I brought a few idle books to read on the way. But one is that reading books in the car is particularly eye-catching, and the other is that idle books are not very forbidden to read, and they have been almost turned by her in only 6 or 7 days. Alas, boring. Lying in her own carriage, Zhang Xuning threw the last book into the corner, stared at the wooden texture on the roof of the carriage, and let out a long sigh. When I lifted the curtain, I saw that there was withered grass everywhere. During this time, they have walked thousands of miles all the way to the north. The scenery of the south of the Yangtze River has gradually changed. The weather is getting colder and colder, and a thin layer of frost has condensed on the red leaves of the distant mountains. Siewei's carriage was not far ahead. Along the way, except for stopping at the post station or in to rest their feet, they almost stayed in their own cars, and it was difficult to touch them, as if they didn't know each other, and they rarely said a word. When she is really free, Zhang Xuning occasionally thinks of this person and thinks about issues related to this person. For example, does she really know what kind of person Xie is? There is no doubt that this man is like the fog on the mountain. It's hard to fathom, it's hard to guess. He behaves moderately, rarely contemptuously, and has an innate dignity. Even if she knew how many killings he had done in his previous life, and how ruthless he was, it was hard to deny that he was indeed worthy of the title of saint's legacy in the world. Sometimes, she even wondered if she was more angry or disappointed in the face of Siewei in the annex at that time. Oppressive, calculating, and cold-hearted, in order to protect the overall situation, he took her to the border to rescue the princess, which certainly made her feel angry that she was played with and applauded. But if you think about it deeply, it may be that she has hope for Siewei. It seems that he shouldn't be like that. Although he is by no means simple, Zhang Xuning subconsciously seems to think that Xie is dangerous and calculating, but he has his own bottom line and principles, and he will never be in the same league as those real sinister villains. Staring at the carriage in front of her, Zhang Xuning came to her senses for a while, and only came back to her senses when a cold wind blew on her face. What does she want to do with all this? After finally rescuing the princess, the bridge returned to the bridge, the road returned to the road, just hide far away, Siewei has nothing to do with her. It's better to think about how to get through this long and boring journey. Thinking about it like this, Zhang Xuning's gaze naturally fell on the body of Dayakan on the side. The young man in blue followed her carriage on horseback with a bow and arrows on his back. She leaned on the window frame and shouted, "Dayakan." Dayakan turned around, and saw her hooking her hand towards herself, and subconsciously glanced at Siewei's carriage in front of her, hesitated, but turned the horse's head, walked side by side with her carriage, got closer, and asked, "Second Miss Ning has orders." Jiang Xuning blinked. "Do you know how to play chess?" Dayakan's body stiffened, and said, "Yes, a little." Jiang Xuaning's eyes suddenly lit up. "That's really good, you get in the car." Dayakan's eyelids jumped. "What do you want to do?" Jiang Xuaning didn't know what kind of reaction he had. How could he be as cowardly as Lucien's cowardice? She was puzzled, but she directly held up a chessboard in her carriage and said, "It's too boring on the road, come and play 2 games with me." Dayakan. He glanced at Jiang Xuaning faintly, only to feel that he was a mold that had fallen for 8 lifetimes, and he really didn't have the courage to answer half a sentence, so he didn't answer at all, and directly clamped the horse's belly and urged the horse to move forward. Jiang Xuning originally wanted to thank the people around Xie Wei and often give him a little face, but when he saw that the knife and piano had moved, he thought that he was going to agree, but where did he think that he would leave directly? If you look closely, this guy is actually heading towards the carriage in front of you. The man leaned over the window and seemed to be leaning against the carriage and said a few words to the inside. It didn't take long to come back. Jiang Xuning didn't realize the seriousness of the matter, and said speechlessly, "Do you still have to ask your husband for a chess game?" Dayakan looked at her. "Sir, please come over." For a moment, all of her expressions froze on her face, and then slowly cracked. Facing Jiang Xuaning's gaze and even accusation, Dayakan felt inexplicably weak, slowly lowered his head, and repeated in a low voice, "Sir, please come over, right now." Jiang Xuning experienced the feeling of wanting to die for a long time. She slowly put down the chessboard, and when she asked the coachman to pull over and stop the car, she only pulled the corner of her lips at Dayakan and smiled. "I can remember being so loyal to your husband." Dayakan didn't dare to reply half a sentence. Jiang Xuning went to Xie Wei's car. As soon as he lifted the curtain, he saw a chessboard in the car. Black and white pieces were staggered on the chessboard, and Xie Wei was still holding a chess game in his hand, which was actually studying the chess game. As soon as she got into the car, her arrogance disappeared, and she whispered, "Sir, is there something to look for me?" Xie Wei glanced at her with his eyelids. "Don't you want to play chess?" Jiang Xuning suddenly felt like eating a Coptus meal. Xie Wei casually pointed to the position in front of him. "Dayakan said that you are bored. Sit down." "I'm bored, but I don't want to die." "What the hell does Dayakan say?" Jiang Xuning roared in her heart, but in the face of Xie Wei, she sat down like a frosted eggplant. Xie Wei asked, "Do you want to be white or black?" Jiang Xuning looked at the chessboard and felt dizzy. Xie Wei said, "Bai Zi wins a big face, you can be white." Jiang Xuning felt tormented. Don't you play Go?" Xie Wei was about to get the hand handed to her by the white chess box, looked at her, and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Then what do you want to play? Chess, Shuanglu?" Jiang Xuning raised her hand weakly. "Is it okay to play backgammon?" Xie Wei. Why did she suddenly feel the urge to throw the box of white seeds in her hand in her face? Jiang Xuning felt that she was not far from death. "Thank you. That's a curse. Strategize and win 1,000 miles of Xiejuan." She actually dared to propose to Xie Wei that this kind of backgammon only children play. Go is so brain-wrenching. She really didn't want to. After saying the words backgammon, Jiang Xuning buried her head, wanting to avoid Xie Wei's almost substantive gaze. Xie Wei didn't speak for a long time. After a while, she began to pack up the chess pieces that were originally placed on the chessboard, and the white and black children were divided, and she put a box of white seeds next to her hand again, and said, "Let's go." Jiang Xuning raised her head. "What's next?" The corner of Xie Wei's eyes twitched, and he said lightly, "If you don't get down, I'll throw you out of the car." Jiang Xuning snorted. touched a white piece without saying a word, and pressed it in the middle of the chessboard. This is Tianyuan. If it is Go, those who dare to play in this position are either fools or geniuses. But it was clear that she didn't touch either. She looked at Xiawei cautiously. Xiawei stared at the chess piece for a moment before he found a black piece to rest next to her chess piece. Zhang Xuning took a look. Okay, the way to play backgammon. She was a little happy in her heart, and immediately followed skillfully. Xiawei is very good at playing Go, Zhang Xuning knows it. However, she thought that backgammon was simpler than Go, and although Xiawei's chess strength was high in such a simple chess game, it might not be useful, which was equivalent to her pulling Xiawei to her own level, and she could defeat the opponent with experience. She only paid attention to the upper right corner, but she didn't expect that the left and left chess pieces had already formed a formation, and Xiawei had another black piece on the chessboard, and 5 of them were in a row. She lost. Zhang Xuning held her breath, thinking that she was almost the same, and she was not reconciled, so she said, "Come again." Xiawei glanced at her, didn't say anything, and shared the chess pieces with her. The two played another game. This time, Zhang Xuning was still a little closer, and was taken a step ahead by Xiawei, and she was greatly choked, and she was very unconvinced. Until the third game, she worked hard, tried her best to cover up, racked her brains and calculated forward, and finally put down the move she had made to induce Xiawei to make a mistake, and then looked at Xiawei quietly to see if he would find out. Xiawei didn't seem to notice it, and really put the chess pieces in the position she wanted. When his fingers left the chess piece, Zhang Xuning finally couldn't hold back his laughter, and immediately put the next move he had prepared earlier, and said, "Ha ha, sir, you have won the trick, I won this game." Xiawei didn't say anything as usual, his face was light. Can fall under Zhang Xuning's eyes, this is to strengthen the face. She didn't care. Happily packed up the chess pieces, but forgot the reluctance when he was just brought over by Xiawei, and single-mindedly calculated the outcome in front of him. In general, Xiawei won more. Can be separated by 3 or 4 sets, and occasionally lose a handful. When Zhang Xuning lost, she frowned, and it was not particularly easy to win. Because of this, it is extremely difficult to extricate itself. It's addictive. Especially when you can win a game occasionally, the joy is hard to hide, and the boredom and depression are swept away, not to mention how happy you are. In the 13th set, he finally won again. When the decisive victory was set, Zhang Xuning's eyes and eyebrows were full of joy. She was very happy. "Sir, the chess strength of Go is amazing, and it will not be useful to change to a child's game like backgammon, right?" Xiawei looked at her, and then looked down at the chessboard. The wind blows the curtain, and the late autumn sun lazily shines on a corner of the black and white chess pieces, each of which flows with a lustrous luster. So following the light, he looked out. Yamakawa Kawadake, Chisato Awano. Wild geese flying south swept by in the distance. Listening to her sentence, "A fool thinks 1,000 times, there must be one," the corners of his lips finally bent shallowly, and the 3 or 5 bright lights fell into the bottom of his eyes, and in the depths of his pupils, he only brewed into an unprecedented warmth and peace. Even the ink painting looks like a clear eyebrow, like the undulating outline of the distant mountains, slowly stretching. Zhang Xuning was about to pack up the chess pieces, when she looked up and looked at it, only to feel that a ball of ice and snow melted in front of her eyes, and she couldn't help but be dazzled. This kind of Xiawei is really too good looking. At this time, she was sent to the gods, and she didn't know where she was lost, so she muttered heartfelt, "It would be nice if Mr. was only Mr. forever." Xiawei heard it and turned his head to look at her. The curvature of the lips slowly faded. Zhang Xuning was really in a trance, and he didn't know what to say in his heart, until his eyes fell on his face, and he suddenly realized that his body immediately became stiff. Siewei's face was expressionless. The previous intoxicating gentleness seemed to have become a human illusion, and he lowered his eyes indifferently, and only said, "Get out." Chapter 193, Bewildering the Enemy. Get out, it's amazing to lose. Getting off Siewei's carriage, the more Jiang Xuning thought about it, the more angry she became. She gritted her teeth and muttered, kicked on the wheel of the carriage angrily, turned around and stomped her feet and walked towards her carriage. The sword book drove the carriage and did not dare to speak. Dayakan also buried her head low when she saw her. Jiang Xuning lifted the curtain of the car and sat in the car, feeling uneasy. In the old days, when she was in the capital, how could she think that Siewei had a good temper? From the time she met in Jinling to the time she has been on the road now, she can be called moody. Obviously, she was still laughing in front of her, and seeing that she was in a good mood, she almost forgot what this person was, what she had done, and what she would do. Isn't it just a game of chess? No one will play with you along the way and you won't die. When the matter is over at the border, how far will my aunt and grandmother go? Jiang Xuning had words in her mouth, and simply fell down and wanted to cover her head and sleep, but after thinking about it, Siewei's underbeaten face was still dangling in her head. Instead of sleeping, she became more and more energetic. She is kind of holding a grudge. She didn't need Siewei to shake her face for the rest of the journey. She first shook her face to Siewei. If she couldn't speak, she wouldn't speak, and if she had to speak, she would also have swords, pianos, swords, and books in the middle, which was completely a posture of not getting along with each other. On the first day of September, they entered the boundary of Tian, Shandong. After deliberation, the people decided to settle down in the city and make a slight repair. When the carriage passed through the city gate, it needed to stop for inspection, and Jiang Xuning heard what seemed to be a begging sound outside the car. She lifted the curtain and looked. Under the city walls gathered a group of ordinary people, both men and women, around a monk with a box on his back, questioning endlessly. The monk's robe was already torn between pushes and shoves, and he kept explaining something and begging for something. Yet the more he spoke, the more he seemed to provoke the anger of those around him. Finally, a woman pulling the child spat in his face, and then a tall man next to him punched the monk in the face. Things immediately got out of hand. There seemed to be fear and anger on the faces of the gathered people, and when one of them made a move, he immediately followed, and all his fists and feet fell on the monk. This is no small movement. Jiang Xuning frowned. There were already guards at the gate of the city, and as soon as they saw this posture, they immediately went to that side, and loudly reprimanded and blocked them. Siewei sat in the car in front of him and saw more clearly. An errand officer was checking to let them into the city. Siewei asked casually, "What's going on over there?" The errand officer inspected the road guide, and saw that these people were either rich or expensive, but they didn't dare to be perfunctory. But when they remembered what had happened in the city recently, they couldn't help but shake their heads, and said, "What else can happen?" Siewei raised his eyebrows, calling the soul. The messenger said, "You don't know from outside, a while ago there was a bridge to be built outside the Wufu temple in the city, and a few monks with a thief heart actually wrote people's names on paper and pasted them on the piers of the bridge to be laid down. The Taoist priest who was too vain said that this is a demon and evil law, and if a person's name is written on paper, the soul will be called away and driven into the bridge pier. With the bridge of the human soul, it will be stronger to build it." No, just now this monk was walking around with a bowl, and he was found to have hair hidden in the box. Another group of officers had gone over to stop the situation. Can't stand the anger of the crowd. Especially the woman who was pulling the child, her voice was high-pitched. "Don't you want to call my son's soul and ask his name for what? There is still hair hidden in the box, and you dare to say that you are not. What is going to happen to my son? I have to pay for your life. Pull him to see the official, pull him to the official. The monk was pulled, his face was already blue and purple, and he cried. The little monk just saw that Ling Lang was kind and wanted to pray for him. But no one listened to him. The officers managed to stabilize the situation, and hurriedly tied him up and dragged him to the officer. The woman in the same place hugged the child and cried, and the rest of the people hugged the servants and went to the yamen together. Xie Wei stared for a moment. The sword and the sword book couldn't help but look back at him. He smiled slowly, didn't mean to pay attention to it, gently lowered the curtain, and said, "Let's go." At this time, Jiang Xuaning's carriage came up a lot, and it happened to take the scene into view. I can't really say what it feels like. Xie Wei looked at the group of people, his eyes were dim, but he couldn't say whether it was pity or ridicule, just so faintly, all his emotions disappeared, and even revealed an amazing indifferent. If a person's name is written on paper, it will be called a soul? I also know that this is impossible. After listening to the words of the Taoist priest, the people were convinced of this, and even panicked. The woman just heard the monk ask the name of her child, so she made a lot of noise, and the people around her were even more afraid and angry, and they would rather believe it or not, and indiscriminately beat the person and dragged him to the official. Jiang Xuaning's heart was slightly cold, especially thinking of Xie Wei's expression. When she passed by the city gate, the noisy sound was already far away, but for some reason, she recalled the story that Lucien told herself about asking for a grain tax in Yin County. What do you think of people and the world? She had been unpleasant for a few days out of boredom, and suddenly she was weighed down by something else. When I arrived at the inn, I stopped all the people. During dinner in the evening, Jianshu went out and came back to talk to Xie Wei for a while. Jiang Xuaning didn't hear it very clearly from a distance, and only knew a little about the matter of calling the soul. It seemed to be a struggle between the heavenly sect and Buddhism, and someone was secretly fanning the flames and adding fuel to the fire. She thought Xie Wei would make a move. I didn't think that this person would listen to it, and he didn't mean to interfere at all. They rested at the inn for only half a day, fed the horses, ate food, and brought some dry food and water, and then went out of the city in the afternoon and went on the official road to the north. She couldn't help but wonder, if you leave in the afternoon, why don't you just rest for a day? Dayakan sat on her horse and walked beside her, as before, and said, "The further north you go, the colder it gets, and the climate will also enter winter, so we must rush to the border before the snow arrives." Jiang Xuaning frowned. After thinking about it, I felt that it made sense, so I simply didn't want to. It was getting dark, and I was sleepy in the car for a while. After walking 7 or 8 miles, she yawned and felt a little like sleeping, so she draped the thick blanket and prepared to lie down. Who expected that just as he was about to move, the curtain of the car was lifted sharply in the dark, and a gust of wind blew in, followed by another dark shadow that sneaked into the car. Jiang Xuaning was suddenly shocked. You must know that the sword and sword book and more than a dozen other good players are on both sides, but just now I didn't hear the slightest strange sound outside, and even when this person came in, the car was still continuing to move. What kind of terrifying person should it be? At this moment, she tensed and was about to scream. However, the comber's movements were extremely fast, and he deceived her and covered her mouth with one hand. The slightly cool palm is calm and powerful. The other party's face was also closer, and a few wisps of hot breath sprinkled on her ears, causing her goosebumps all over her body. Only then did I see some familiar silhouettes in the extremely dim light outside the blowing curtain. It turned out to be Xie Wei. Jiang Xuaning blinked in shock, and finally didn't dare to move this time. Yes. There are obviously so many people outside. If it weren't for Xie Wei, how could there be no movement at all? But what's going on right now? She was a little confused. Siewei's clear-cut face was blurred in the darkness, like a dormant beast, giving people a sense of danger. The two thin lips were tightly pursed, but a pair of eyes peered silently through the narrow slit in the curtain. Jiang Xuning looked out. It took a lot of effort to barely find that there was a fork in the official road ahead, and their car continued to the north, while the carriage that Siewei was originally riding turned silently towards the west when it passed the fork in the road, got on the fork in the road, and gradually disappeared into the overlapping shadows of the trees. Although Jiang Xuning is not being Shue's smart, but after looking at this posture, what else does she not understand? Someone's eyeing them. All of a sudden, my heart beat like a drum. She didn't dare to move, for fear that she would accidentally ruin Siewei's plan, so she let him press herself into the soft velvet blanket, cover her mouth, and don't even dare to gasp. Chapter 194, Risk. From Jinling to the border, Siewei walked with her, and the excuse he made was to help Zhang Boyo take her back to the capital. And the car that took the fork in the road just now was Siewei's car, but Siewei himself hid in her car silently. In just a moment, Jiang Xuning could judge. No matter who the person in the secret is, it seems that they are all coming for Siewei. The interior of the car was very quiet. Half of the horses followed Siewei's car, and they didn't even get off the car. Outside, the sound of horses' hooves trampling on the official road as usual, and the whispered conversations of the accompanying guards, and the crumbling of the wheels of the carriage passing through the barren grass, and even the sound of Siewei, who was very close to her, cautiously suppressed and lightened breathing. And your own heartbeat. Time seems to be stretched out in such an extremely tight silence. Jiang Xuning couldn't even tell how long it had been. I felt that I was numb all over, and then I heard the knife and Qin outside quietly approaching the carriage, and whispered, "It seems to have been let over, and no one has followed for the time being." Siewei frowned, but his tense body did not relax. Jiang Xuning's lips moved and she wanted to speak. But when the situation was urgent, Siewei was afraid that she would scream in a panic, revealing a flaw, and when he reached out to cover her, he was very tight, and his palm was against her lips. She wanted to speak, and her lips moved, and she pressed her palm to his palm. It's a soft touch. Sticking to the fragile place of the human palm, it adds a bit of moist and damp ambiguity. Siewei only felt that his palm was slightly numb as if it had been electrified. He stared back at her, slowly withdrawing his palm. Jiang Xuning gasped for a long time, hurriedly sat up against the wall of the carriage, raised her hand to stroke her chest that was heaving due to the violent heartbeat, and whispered urgently, "What's the matter?" The carriage that was originally one person entered two people at the moment, especially Siewei, who was long and in the same place with her, made the carriage even more cramped, and it was a little crowded. He sat cross-legged in the carriage. He only replied, "Turn the tiger away from the mountain." Jiang Xuning almost rolled his eyes. Who doesn't know that this is a plan to divert the tiger from the mountain? But the question is, what kind of tiger is the tiger and where does it come from? She took a deep breath, sorted out the clues of these days, and suddenly remembered the incident she heard in the Tian Mansion Inn, and a flash of inspiration, heavenly sect. There are some traces of wetness left in the palm, and it is a light cherry pink. In the narrow space, there is a faint sweet smell of fat powder. Siewei's fingers trembled slightly, his eyelids jumped, and he took a brocade handkerchief on the side and wiped it slowly, but his brows were furrowed very tightly, and he said, "It's almost the same." Jiang Xuning subconsciously wanted to ask again, why did the heavenly sect want to hunt him down? But as soon as he raised his eyes, his gaze touched Siewei, who was nearby, and he felt that his posture with his head lowered had a deep and dangerous condensation, so he suddenly remembered his previous life. At that time, the heavenly sect even dared to assassinate the emperor. What is it to attack a close minister like Siewei? It's just too normal. She sighed and said, These gangs of gangsters are bold, but on this official road, I don't think they dare to be too blatant, and the number of people will not be too large. The gentleman anticipates the enemy first, and strategizes, but there is no need to worry about them. Jiang Xuning has confidence in Xie Wei. Xie Wei didn't speak with a calm face. So, Jiang Xuning sighed in her heart, and faintly felt that this time things might not be so simple. Sure enough, before the two of them sat quietly in the car for 2 moments, Dayakan outside suddenly shouted, "Stop!" The crowd hurried to rein in their horses. The carriage also stopped. There was silence. This official road is far away from Tian province, near a mountain Col, and on the east and west sides are continuous mountains, and there are almost no houses in sight, so quiet that even the sound of the wind blowing through the woods can be heard. And looking in the direction they came, there was a jackdaw flying up in the woods, faintly, and the sound of horses' hoofs was near. Dayakan's pupil suddenly shrank sharply, and almost immediately drew the long knife tied to the side of the saddle, cursed something in a low voice, and said to the coachman in front, "Keep up, go quickly." The coachman snapped and threw the whip on the horse. The horse raised its hooves and immediately moved forward, galloping violently. It's a lot more bumpy than before. Jiang Xuning didn't pay attention, and fell forward. Fortunately, Xie Wei was quick and prepared, and put a handful on her forehead in time to prevent her from slamming her head to the window edge and ending up in a broken situation. Jiang Xuning didn't care about crying out in pain, covered her head and said, "Could it be that the sword book has already been exposed?" Xie Wei's voice was extremely deep. "It won't be so fast. Half of the people on the sword book side are divided, which doesn't seem to be much, but all of them are good at 1 and 10, even if they are found to be moving, it is impossible for the people chasing them to solve it in such a short time, and they can turn their heads to catch up with them." In a flash, another ominous premonition suddenly crept up. Xie Wei lifted the curtain of the car and went out, and shouted coldly, "Dayakan, horse." Dayakan was stunned, but with years of experience and tacit understanding in following Xie Wei, without saying a word, he patted the saddle under him, and the whole person flew up, directly let the horse under him, and fell onto the carriage. Xie Wei turned over and got on the horse directly. Then he shouted into the car, "Ning Er, come out." Jiang Xunning's heart was beating for a while, and she didn't have time to think about what had happened, so she hurriedly got out of the car. Before anyone could stand firmly, his waist was tight. With a flower in front of him, he felt that the world was spinning, and the whole person had been fished on the horse by Xie Wei, sat in front of him, and was taken into his arms. Almost at the same time, the sound of horses' hooves behind him had become clear. It was as if someone was shouting. Immediately followed by the sound of whooshing and swishing breaking through the air, dozens of carved arrows broke through the air. Tuk tuk. The back half of the carriage almost immediately turned into a hedgehog. Dayakan slashed 2 arrows with one sword, but was shocked and numb, and suddenly felt a little frightened and a little shocked, and said to Xie Wei, "There is no way that there is such a powerful archer in the sect. Arrows are flying, and it is impossible to see clearly in the night." Xie Wei's anger suddenly grew in his heart. There was a sound of wind breaking through the sky next to his ears, and the tips of his eyebrows were like ice, and between the lightning and the stone fire, he only flicked his fingers into the darkness beside him. Smack! The arrows that galloped in the darkness were immediately shaken away. Jiang Xuning only felt a coolness pass in front of her cheeks, and it was the arrow that was wiped away close to her ear, which was thrilling. Before the pursuers appeared, the rain of arrows came first. You don't have to think about it to know how many people are in the back. Xie Wei's fingers tightly clasped the reins, looked into the deep mountains and dense forests to the west, quickly thought about it, his voice was almost frozen, and said categorically, "You continue to move forward." Dayakan immediately responded, "Yes." Jiang Xuning was shocked, and before she could figure out what Xie Wei meant, she saw him turn his horse's head and lead her to gallop towards the deep dense forest on the side. Heavy tree shadows, in the sky and mountains, dark and layered. The horses were frightened and ran as fast as they could. It wasn't like taking them into the forest, but it was like this deep and silent dense forest rushing towards them, and the oncoming cold wind drowned out Jiang Xuning's words, making her have to shrink between Xie Wei's arms and close her eyes tightly. Soon there was the sound of hand-to-hand combat from the rear, sometimes mixed with people and people's screams and shouts. It's just too chaotic to judge the situation. Xie Wei didn't look back at all. His calmness, bordering on coldness. The horses galloped towards the depths of the forest. The assassin arrows that had just arrived were still some distance away from them, and it was impossible to tell in the darkness that they were out of the carriage, or if there was a horse missing from the crowd. That's where the biggest vitality lies. I don't know how long I ran forward, but the woods in front of me became denser and denser, and low thorns began to appear on the ground. Xie Wei turned over and dismounted, and handed out a hand to Jiang Xuning. "Come down." Jiang Xuning subconsciously put her hand in his palm. With all his strength, he put his other hand on her waist and helped her off the horse. When she was on her feet, she didn't have time to say anything, but took off the quiver hanging from the saddle and carried it on her back, and then took the bow and jerked it vigorously on the horse's hips. The horse was in pain, neighed, raised its front hooves, and galloped out into the woods. Along the way, they broke branches and trampled on rotting leaves. Behind it, visible traces were left. Xie Wei didn't go that way, but walked down the hillside in front of him. Jiang Xuning's head was clouded. "We escaped. What should we do with the sword and chain?" Xie Wei didn't reply. "I can't die." Jiang Xuning's heart trembled, and she followed him with some difficulty, and suddenly felt that this miserable situation was indescribably familiar, so she laughed, and laughed a little self-deprecatingly. "I found out, with you, sir, there will be no peace." A total of 3 times together, back unlucky. Was attacked back then, and now he is assassinated, and his life is tied to the tip of the knife. Xie Wei stopped abruptly. Jiang Xuning didn't pay attention to the collision, just hit his straight back, couldn't help baring his teeth in pain, and looked up. "Sir." Xie Wei looked back at her. Only a few fragments of starlight poured down from the gaps in the branches and leaves, and landed on his shoulders, and his silent figure seemed to merge with the dark mountain forest. Jiang Xuning was suddenly a little nervous. "I'm not." Xie Wei turned around in silence and only said, "You're right. It didn't end well with me." Chapter 195, The Past is Like Yesterday. Jiang Xuning felt that Xie Wei did not seem to be very right. She was just a joke, but when he answered that, it seemed to add a heavy shadow. But when you think about it, there's nothing wrong with that. After all, it's the truth. When she was taken back to the capital from the Grange, she was accompanied by Xie Wei. The difference is that she just went home, but Xie Wei was incognito, and wanted to quietly enter Beijing to help Shen Lang win the heir. Naturally, no one would go to great lengths to kill her. That time, the assassination halfway to find trouble, was obviously aimed at Xie Wei. 2 years ago, she was involved in Xie Wei's establishment of a bureau to eradicate the heavenly sect, and on the way back to Beijing from Tongzhou, a group of people were also assassinated. Of course, these dead soldiers are not here for Jiang Xuning. They all came for the Dingfei son who was merciful to God and survived. As for this time, she pondered left and right, and felt that she had not offended anyone, and if she had gone to the border alone, she would not have attracted anyone's attention. The bad thing is that it's on the same road as Xie Wei. Thinking of this, her brows furrowed tighter, and she couldn't help but say, "Do you know who is going to kill you?" Xie Wei held a bow and an arrow on his back, continued to walk forward, and said, "There are too many people who want to kill me." Jiang Xuning said speechlessly, "What about this time?" Daikon said that the people of the heavenly sect dash. "No, it's not. That's not what Daikon said." At this point, a tight string in her mind suddenly trembled, causing her whole body to shiver with excitement, as if she had been thrown into ice water, and suddenly sobered up. At the previous critical moment, Daikon said not that the heavenly sect will never have such a powerful archer, but that there will never be such a powerful archer in the sect. Heavenly sect, teaching. The difference between one word and the deep meaning contained in it is thousands of miles away. Who would say in the teaching instead of heavenly teaching? Jiang Xuning's eyelids jumped and looked at Xie Wei, who was walking in front of her. Xie Wei didn't seem to notice how much shock was hidden under her abruptly stopped words, and maybe he didn't care at all, so he just said, "The rats in the rivers and lakes hide their heads and tails, and they can't raise such elites, and they are inseparable from the DPRK and China. It doesn't matter who it is, they will all be killed at that time, and there will be no fish that slip through the net." Jiang Xuning was speechless. Xie Wei smiled in front of him. "I thought you knew my true face." Knowing is understanding, but vaguely knowing and hearing with your own ears are not the same feelings. Jiang Xuning didn't want to know more about him. The more you know, the deeper the danger. In the previous life she was already involved in too deep a dispute, and in this life after saving the princess, there is nothing else to ask for. She looked at the dense forest around her, but she couldn't see the road at all, and she felt a little anxious, and at the same time quietly changed the topic. "Aren't we going back?" Xie Wei said, "There is no one in the carriage, they will find out sooner or later. A cursory calculation will tell us when we will flee, and we will surely lay a net on the road we had taken before. To turn back is to fall into the net." Jiang Xuning frowned. "Then where are we going?" Xie Wei said, "Jinan Mansion." Jiang Xuning's brows furrowed even deeper, and she couldn't help but doubt, "Mr. knows the way." Xie Wei broke off a branch blocking the road in front of him, and was very calm. "To the north of Tian is Jinan, just turn over this mountain. The most dangerous place is the safest place, knowing that there are tigers in the mountains, and preferring to go to the Tiger Mountains." Jiang Xuning was completely speechless.
明知山有虎，偏向虎山行。
God knows if you accidentally died in the belly of a tiger. It is not easy to walk in the mountains in late autumn, not to mention that when you look around, the jungle is dense, the wind is blowing, and the mountains are rugged and precipitous, and it will not take long to walk and make people breathless and exhausted. Xie Wei has long hands and long feet, and opens the way in front. Jiang Xuning said a few words to him at the beginning, but then he was neither in the mood nor with the strength. It was only 2 moments, and there was already a layer of sweat on his forehead, so he could only walk with his head down, stepping on the footprints left by Xie Wei in front of him, and walked forward step by step with difficulty. In the middle of the night, the mountains are silent. The dead branches and rotten leaves spread a thick layer in the forest, and half of the soles of the feet can sink in the shallow places, but half of the legs can be buried in the depths. The sound of their march is infinitely amplified in the silence. Sometimes it even makes people suspect that it is not their own voice, but that there is something else behind them. This feeling is very familiar. Jiang Xuning thought that she had forgotten it for a long time, but when the same situation and similar situation came again, those unbearable memories of the old days all emerged from a corner that had been covered by darkness for a long time. Like a reef that emerges after the tide has receded. Although he has changed his original shape under the erosion of flowing water and the accumulation of dust and sand, and even moved his original position, he is still there, always there, and has never disappeared. Only when there is no more earthly interference between heaven and earth, and the whole person is shrouded in terrifying nature, can man truly realize his own insignificance and truly face his deep heart full of scars. Xie Wei hadn't heard her speak for a while. "You can only hear the sound of a foot deep and a shallow foot behind you," sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. And the wheezing. But I never heard any of her requests to slow down or wait a minute. She just struggled to keep up with him. Siewei suddenly felt like he had returned to the original time. He looked back at her. Zhang Xuning fell behind. The originally delicate clothes were scratched a little by the branches and thorns around him during the walk, showing a little embarrassment, and the combed black hair also fell a few strands messily. She picked up a wooden stick and used it as a crutch in her hand, but after all, she was not as tall as him, and she did not have an exceptionally strong physique, so it was extremely difficult to walk his completely clenched teeth, supported by an unyielding arrogance in his bones. Like a wheat in the plains. Silence, tenacity. That kind of demeanor easily overlapped with the self-respecting girl at the beginning. Compared to 6 years ago, she has only grown taller and more open. Nothing really has changed. But Siewei suddenly thought, she should be a flower in the garden, not a grass on the plain. When he approached, there was a tall tree shadow overhead, blocking the starlight that was not much in the cold night. Zhang Xuning couldn't help but be a little unable to see his feet, and he didn't pay attention to the roots of a tree on the side that extended over and protruded from the ground, and suddenly stumbled. Siewei stretched out his hand and held her. Clasp your palms together. Everything seems to be business as usual. Only then, she would purse her lips and frown, and would rather fall to the ground than brush his hand away, but now, the little girl who has grown up, just looks up at him, and after a moment of silence, says to him, "Thank you." It doesn't seem to have changed, but something seems to be quietly circulating. The rest of the way, inexplicably quieter and quieter. Both of them had their own hearts, and neither of them spoke. Sometimes when he walked fast, Siewei would stop and wait, and Zhang Xuning would not blindly be strong. If there were any slopes and ravines, he would not be able to get through, and he would also grab the hand handed by Siewei, trying not to slow down his journey. Siewei said that before the snow falls, he should climb over this mountain. Zhang Xuning then remembered what Dayakan said before it snowed, he should rush to the border pass. When Dayakan spoke, she didn't think deeply. But when the words were almost the same, from Siewei's mouth, she had a conjecture that was not very optimistic. Siewei didn't give any explanation. Another slanted branch in front of him blocked the way. He stretched out his hand, and as soon as he broke the branch, he heard the movement of the squirrel, and something hissed. Almost at the same time, there was a sharp stabbing pain from the index finger of his right hand near the palm of his hand. His pupils constricted sharply. Something bit him, but in the darkness he didn't make the slightest sound, just backhanded the sharp break of the broken branch, and stabbed it into the cold and soft body of the thing, with a faint snort sound. Zhang Xuning walked behind, didn't see it at all, and only asked, "What's wrong with Mr.?" Siewei was afraid of scaring her, so he threw the thing away. He said, "It's okay." The two of them walked forward for another 2 hours. After all, they were only mortals, and they would be tired after a long time. Fortunately, the mountain in front of me has finally been overcome. Zhang Xuning followed Siewei out of the woods, and saw a deep valley between the two mountains, and a clear stream meandering down from a distance. The east has lit up with the white of the fish's belly, the subtle morning light shines from the shadows of the trees, and the thin mist floats like a light veil, as if it has turned into a fairyland outside the world in the eyes of those who have traveled all the way. She was overjoyed, and immediately ran down, crouched down by the stream, bowed and poured water on her stained cheeks, and sighed comfortably. Then I remembered Siewei. Turning around, he shouted, "Sir, we'll rest here, sir." Siewei didn't follow. When Zhang Xuning turned his head, he only saw him sitting on the edge of an exposed mountain rock on the hillside, his eyes closed. I heard her voice, and I didn't open my eyes to look. After a moment's wait, he still sat still. Jiang Xuning walked back again, went up the hillside, and shouted again, "Sir." Xie Wei gently closed his eyes. The light of the first day shone on his face, and there was a sickly paleness. Jiang Xuning almost thought that he was asleep, and stretched out his hand to put his shoulder on his shoulder, but suddenly saw that he was hanging down on the index finger of his right hand on his lap, and there were 2 crimson blood holes. At this moment, Jiang Xuning felt a biting chill. The icy stream slid down her cheeks. She quietly stared at the calm face in front of her, and actually gave birth to a little pathos that bordered on panic, paused for a moment before reacting, almost tremblingly grasped Xie Wei's palm, took his index finger knuckle into her mouth, and sucked hard. A salty smell gushed out of the blood holes. She took a small gulp and spat it out to the side. But I panicked for no reason. Xie Wei's eyelashes moved. He opened his eyes calmly, looked at her, but said without waves, "Are you still afraid of the dead?" Jiang Xuning was suddenly stunned. Her lips were slightly cold, but the tip of her tongue was warm, and she raised her head at this moment, only facing the pair of deep and awake pupils, and there was no snake venom at all, and she was not unconscious at all. "You." In an instant, like the one who had been bitten by a snake, she threw away his hand and stepped aside, looking at him vigilantly and angrily. Xie Wei slowly withdrew his hand. There was still a little warmth left in the fingers. His gaze fell on Jiang Xuning, and he didn't move away, but opened his mouth to take the wound into it, and after tasting a touch of blood on the tip of his tongue, he said slowly, "Didn't that foot doctor and charlatan teach you to distinguish back then? This is mocking her for the stupid thing of cutting her wrists and feeding blood." Jiang Xuning's chest rose and fell, and she was so angry that she couldn't speak. Xie Wei's gaze made her feel even more terrified of being targeted by a poisonous snake, and even his voice had a kind of coldness that made people tremble. "I am your husband, although I forbid the desire to feast and devote myself to the study of the Buddha, I can learn from non-saints. Barren mountains and mountains, people are like wild beasts. If you still want to marry a good man, and you don't want to be destroyed by me afterwards, I advise you to stay away from me." Jiang Xuning is not a fool. Just hearing the words, the desire of the feast made her eyelids jump. However, people are prone to rebellion when they reach their limits. When fear reaches the extreme, it turns into anger. It's all fallen into such a field. The surname Xie hasn't spoken half a sentence in his mouth. How does the energy up and down his body look like the word work? She doesn't know which tendon is twisted, which backbone, and sneered, "Yes? Mr. Xie is very self-cultivation, and nothing else. Duplicity is really powerful. I'm worried. I don't know who sleeps with whom, and who's at a loss."